So again, I just introduced myself, Matt Hall, the editorial and opinion director with the Union-Tribune. Thank you. Checks in the mail for everyone who claps. This is Laura Sacalo, the managing editor of the Union-Tribune. And Brooke Binkowski, one of the best fact checkers on the planet. Checks in the mail, Brooke. I'm not joking, she really is talented. Great panel. Thank you all for coming. First, give yourselves a round of applause for being here. And we have some slides that we're going to go through, and then I already have a ton of questions, some very good ones. I'm going to start with one of them, because it's intriguing. How many of you think how many of you trust the president more than the news media? No hissing, no hissing. Come on, this is going to be a civil conversation. Thanks to those who raised their hands, in all honesty. How many of you trust the news media more than the president or other politicians who use the term fake news? Let me ask, when I talk to groups like this, we take a version of this slideshow around the county, and I actually travel around the country giving it, and I like to ask these questions to get a sense of the room. How many of you get your news from a newspaper, preferably the Union-Tribune, although this is not all that self-promotional? How many of you get your news from television? From the radio? Preferably KBBS, although again, not that self-promotional. You guys can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. So what I just asked was how many get your news from television, TV, excuse me, the newspaper, TV, and radio. How many of you get it from news websites, like Voice of San Diego, for example? How many of you get it through social media? Okay, you guys are part of the problem. No, I'm kidding, I'm kidding. How many get it through podcasts? Okay. Newsletters? Okay. Point being, there are a ton of ways to get your news. There's a lot of news out there. How many of you think that fake news is a recent phenomenon? Okay. I'm going to tell you right now that it's not. How many of you know, last question before I launch into my slides, just shout out a year. What year the First Amendment was ratified? (1791). You are all correct. Also, 2 points of order. One is we're going to show a short video before we do our slides. It's a great video done by my colleague Luis Cruz right here. The other is if you are on your phones, that's totally okay during this presentation. If you're on Twitter, please use the hashtags #GrabABook or SDFOB, which is San Diego Festival of Books. And now a short video.
Fake news.
CNN's fake news.
So-called fake news.
CNN is fake news.
Fake news.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think.
What is fake news?
That's a hard question, actually.
Fake news is anything without a reliable source, I guess.
I think that we are living in a world where there's a lot of information and sometimes there's a lot of misinformation. And everything that you read and see is not always accurate.
How can you tell if something is fake news?
Gosh. That's a very good question.
Actually, it is difficult to tell if it's fake news sometimes. And I think it's also up to the responsibility of the person who is actually reading the article or seeing something on television to actually do a little bit of research and be sure that the information that they're getting is actually accurate.
But right now with the media, I mean, someone posts an article or Twitter, and a lot of people believe that because they don't want to do their own research.
I'm a big fan of checking sources and making sure I can find the same data on multiple places on the internet.
How do you think fake news affects us and our society?
Oh, I think it's causing a lot of discord right now. I don't know how to explain it, but I know that it is prolific on the internet and on Facebook and different sites. There's a lot of fake news, and I think it's causing a lot of division and pain between people who are normally friends.
It's a very powerful thing, social media, and how this affects us. So if you put out a fake piece of news, people could go into panic without looking up reliable sources.
I mean, you have the stuff that's, from Russia or from different organizations where they're intentionally trying to post fake news. And the challenge, I think, today's too is that somehow it's become acceptable for politicians, I'm not going to name any names, but I think we all know who I'm talking about. You can outright lie and it's somehow okay.
I think it's gotten a lot worse, and I think it's very negative in our society. Obviously, it's gotten very partisan in our politics, and it's kind of tearing our country apart. So I think that Americans need to safeguard themselves and checking sources and making sure what they hear on the news and what they read on the internet is real and verifiable, and it's important for our politics and for the future of our country.
Fake news.
It's fake news.
So-called fake news.
That's a pretty good segue, because it is important. If there's no other takeaway you have, although I hope there are a few, remember that this is a vital discussion, a crucial discussion, not just for those of us in this room, but for democracy with a small d, for the future of the planet, really. And I want to say this too, there are way more questions, we've already got way more questions than we can answer today, but I'm the kind of guy who stays past my kids' bedtime every night at work to answer the emails I get. So I'll make a promise to you. If you guys have a question for me, do two things for me. Email it to me at matthew.hall@sduniontribune.com. But I get thousands of emails a day, not all of them complimentary, and sometimes it takes me a while to respond to them. So just, if you wouldn't mind, if you do that, in the subject line, write fake news panel. And thank you again for being here. So here we go. We already talked about the First Amendment. Some of us in this room can probably recite it by memory. I won't ask you to. It's here in front of you. Again, it was written in 1791. When I asked about fake news and how many of you think it's a relatively new phenomenon, it is not. This is an image that you can find by Googling fake news and seeing that Puck magazine back in the 1800s had an image that shows a gentleman in a very nice bowler hat running around with fake news. You'll also see newspapers being held up. Cheap sensation and humbug news. Now, if I had my druthers, that the hashtag we'd all be talking about is humbug news, because that's funnier. But this is not a funny issue. Next slide. So the reason why we started this with a video is to drive home the point that fake news means many things to many people. It really operates on a spectrum, and even more so now, since we've done these slides, increasingly you see fake news being used, I've already got some questions about this, not as a presence, as a thing, but as an absence. You're fake news because you didn't cover X, Y, or Z, right? So fake news is morphing, and even today. So here we go, I'll just read it. Fake news is false or inaccurate information. Can you guys hear me if I'm back here with the mic now? No. Fake news is false or inaccurate information spread by accident or design. It operates on a spectrum. It can include poor journalism, information without context, clickbait or sensationalism, and all the way to conspiracy, propaganda, and hoaxes. And how many of you are familiar with the term propaganda? That is a relatively new phrase, because it means people using propaganda for money. A lot of the websites you saw during the presidential election popping up with false news about either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump were not done by their supporters, were not done by their opponents, but sometimes were done by their supporters who saw a way to cash in really quickly. So I often say, if we can talk about real news and all have an agreement on that, then fake news becomes far, far less important, right? And so real news, as you'll see here, just look at the adjectives. I'm not going to read it to you. You guys can all read it for yourselves. But honest, true, real, right? You get the gist. Importantly, it acknowledges that there are different perspectives, that there's a range of opinions. That's why I asked at the beginning who trusts the president or other politicians, or who trusts the media, quote unquote. And just as importantly, if not more, it acknowledges that people can see facts in different ways. Next slide. Now, fake news isn't a new phenomenon, as we just proved, but it really came into the public consciousness and the zeitgeist during the presidential election. More than any other chart you'll find on the internet, this one proves that. It shows that fake news is kind of muddling along where it belongs, you know, out of sight, out of mind. And mainstream news is on the trajectory that we all know that it is, being read by fewer and fewer people. And the few months leading up to the election, there's a change. Now, what this chart shows specifically is engagements on Facebook, which means likes and shares and comments. And so it's flipped leading up to the election. And you started to see stories like Pope endorses Trump, you know, which, for those who don't know, the Pope doesn't endorse in any election, let alone an American election. Next slide, please. This is the question that this was an unscientific poll that I took earlier. This is a scientific poll done by a reputable polling group for Quinnipiac University just last month that asked the question by political affiliation, who do you trust more to tell the truth, the administration or the media? As you'll see, Republicans are largely supporting the Republican in office. Democrats, to a certain extent, and independents, to a larger extent, are as well. So, you know, this is not just a partisan issue. Next slide. Here's a tweet from our president just this month, where he again doubled down on his rhetoric of fake news and enemy of the people, and started to use adjectives like dangerous and sick. You know, now the First Amendment protects your right to say things. It also protects the media. It's a foundational element of what the media, the free and the fair press, does every day. Next slide. But there are real consequences to comments like this, and increasingly more people are saying them. This is a real phone call that I won't read, but you can see for yourselves the vitriol that happened. This just came into the AP newsroom a couple days ago. So serious that LAPD investigated it. Now, this is not a us versus them problem. The media owns this problem, or we should. Some of it is self-inflicted. Media outlets need to acknowledge when we make mistakes, correct them quickly, or investigate to see if we should correct them. So bias is a big issue. And you can see over the last 2 generations, more people see bias in news coverage. And this doesn't just mean that they see it, it means that it actually exists to a certain extent. You can see that, stay on that slide for 1 second. It's basically doubled from 1989 to now. And almost half of the people, again, when you see a poll, make sure that it's not a Twitter poll, make sure it's a reputable poll. This is done by Pew, conducted by the firm you can see. So this is, I would call, a reputable poll, and it shows that nearly half of the people who answered this poll see bias in media. So what does the media do about this? Today we're going to answer the questions about not only what we can do, but what you can do. There's going to be some tips that you can learn, and we're going to have a discussion. I'm kind of teeing up the past of this discussion. I think Laura will talk about the present, and Brooke will talk about, among other things, the future. This was just a few days ago. How many of you guys know that on this day, Thursday, August 16th, 350 editorial boards published editorials in their newspapers defending a free press? How many of you guys read at least one of those editorials? How many of you guys thought it was a silly exercise and that we helped the administration more than defended a free press? How many of you thought that the message was a free press is important and that was the message received? Okay. So this was our version of that. It's very rare you see a full-page editorial in any newspaper, let alone ours. This was not on the front page, this was on the editorial page, which I think is an important distinction to draw. Editorial board, editorial page is separate from the news side, which is unbiased, or should be, unbiased. And so in doing this and writing a longer editorial with a bigger headline, we lost Steve Breen's art. And as Tom Carlo said, Steve Breen is a San Diego treasure. I don't just say that because I'm his boss. I really think he's gifted. He's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Thank you. And so we wanted an element that came with this, and this is what Steve came up with. I loved it. Next slide. So in closing, from my perspective, I'm just going to zip through 11 ways that this is what you can do to make sure you can tell real news from fake news. And again, I gave you my email at the beginning. Again, it's matthew.hall@SD Union-Tribune. If you want this PowerPoint, subject fake news panel, I'll send it to you so you can have it as well. Because we're kind of going to zip through these in the interest of time. What can you guys do? Here's some things you can do. Read beyond the headline. The headline should deliver. It should not overpromise. If it's overly sensational, yeah, we got you. Thanks for clicking on that story. You're not going to click on our content a second story. So this is something we take very seriously. We want to engage you, but we want to get it right. Real news wants to get it right. Check the date. A lot of times you see this, especially in stories with long tails, immigration, healthcare, where especially politicians change their mind, as they do from time to time. Important to check the date of a news story. Consider the source, look at the URL. When Amazon was looking to put its second headquarters around the country somewhere, it still is, there was one weekend about 6 months ago where my Facebook timeline was a lot of my friends saying, it's coming to San Diego, this is awesome, citing a source that said cbs.com.co. Now that is not, it looks like CBS, it's not CBS, so be mindful of the URL. Check the author. A reputable outlet will have a way to contact that author. You can reach out via email and many other ways to any UT reporter, to most serious outlets. They go out of their way to help you connect with them and criticize their work or say that they got it wrong, and it's our job to listen. This is important. Ask yourself if it's a joke. I think The Onion, every time there's this is my editorial opinion, I'm an editorial writer, not an unbiased journalist, so I get to make this. Every time there's a school shooting in America, The Onion puts out their story with a headline that says, America is the only country on the planet where this happens, da, 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 da. There should be a Pulitzer for headline writing for satirical outlets. Again, my editorial aside, make sure you know if it's a joke before you share it and perpetuate its reality. And I apologize for zipping through these, but again, it's what we got to do here to get to your questions. Look for supporting sources. A good outlet will have links to an indictment, to a court report, to a city hall report, to whatever it is, to another outlet. The Union-Tribune does not just link to its own work. We'll link to Voice of San Diego and KPBS, television stations, other outlets around the country. This is important. Do we annotate corrections? Yeah, we make corrections. We're human. We make mistakes. Sometimes they're big mistakes. But real news, real journalists own up to that. They will correct it and acknowledge it. This is important. A lot of people don't like it. This is one of maybe the most difficult one. Check your own biases. If you're somewhere on the political spectrum, realize, that you approach the world with your worldview. So it helps to be aware, just as journalists need to be aware of their own biases and blind spots. Ask a friend. Facebook, all sorts of fact-checking, as Brooke will talk about, places to turn on the online. Call a reporter. If you got a friend who's a reporter, ask them. And again here, distinguish between news and opinion. This can't be emphasized enough. I think when I alluded earlier to journalists not acknowledging the issue, not being proactive enough, owning this issue, one of the problems that fake news has become as big an issue as it is because journalists for too long didn't do this. They didn't speak to hundreds of people or make themselves available. They didn't say, okay, you know what, we got it wrong. We assumed and we expected people to understand what we were doing, and that isn't the case. So I will say, if you go to our website right now, you will see, if you go to www.stut.us/whatwedo, you'll see what we do, how we handle anonymous sources, how we decide if something is news or not, how we fact check things and make sure it's fair and accurate and inclusive. You're going to start seeing journalists all over the world be more inclusive with our readers. It's something we should have done a long time ago. We're doing it now. Thank you for being here. I look forward to getting into some of your questions later. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Matt. That was a great introduction. And as Matt mentioned, there are lots of things that you as news consumers can do to differentiate between real news and fake news. But we have a serious obligation as journalists to help you to do that and to make sure that the news that you're consuming when you come to our sites or pick up our newspapers is unbiased and reputable, and you can trust it as being real news. So here are some of the values and the precepts that we abide by as journalists. These are important not only to us in our relationship to you, but in maintaining our credibility. So as Matt mentioned, just as you need to check your own biases, we have to do the same. We have to be constantly mindful of our own values and our preconceived ideas when we're doing our jobs. Looking at our word choices, the way we write stories, the way we edit stories, very, very important. Looking at every single adjective we're using to describe someone or to describe maybe a judgment or the reason that something is happening. Making those stories as neutral and unbiased as we possibly can. The idea of diversity. Hopefully when you pick up a newspaper or you're reading our site online, you're looking and you're seeing an inclusive view, lots and lots of ideas, lots of perspectives included in that. Presenting stories in a way that it allows the readers to come to their own conclusion. You have a diversity of views, you have a diversity of sources in our stories as well. And being transparent, this idea that we explain how we produce our stories. The site that Matt was just discussing, this page that you can find, has our policies, our fairness policy, our watchdog checklist, our policy on corrections. You should expect that same kind of transparency from other news organizations as well. How are they reporting? What is their standard? How do they handle when they're wrong? That's a huge part of maintaining our credibility. Fairness. Obviously, that's the cornerstone, being fair and accurate. It's at the root of all we do, and it's how we maintain our credibility. Without that, we are not serving journalism or our public. We strive to represent the various points of view and the various perspectives within stories. And again, looking at our word choices and how we're editing, displaying, capsulizing those stories. We give our sources an opportunity to respond. We don't call somebody up who's the subject of a news story, and if we don't get them, say, oh well, we'll go ahead. We need to give them adequate. Sometimes they will choose not to respond. They won't get back, but we need to give them an adequate opportunity to be fair in our reporting. And looking for diversity in sourcing. So not only the diversity of perspectives, but gender, ethnic, geographic diversity in who we include in our stories to help make sure that we're capturing this diversity of opinions and ideas. This is something that you can find. The museum has a great educational portion of their website. This is a poster that they have that they use as part of their educational program on fake news. So I won't go through the whole thing. You can access this either on our website or through the museum site, but it's a great kind of handy way to go through material to determine if there might be an agenda behind that material. Should you trust this or not? So looking at the evidence, the sourcing, the context, the audience, looking at the purpose behind that material. That's very helpful in differentiating between real news and fake news. And then how is that information presented? And lastly, as Matt mentioned, join the conversation. We have a responsibility to you to respond to your concerns, your criticisms, your feedback. So you can email Matt, you can email me, you can email Jeff Light, our editor and publisher. We have a reader's representative, Adrian Vore. We are dependent on the feedback from you. Hold us accountable. Part of our job is to be responsive, to correct when we make a mistake. We're human. Our goal certainly is to be accurate all the time, every time, but when we make a mistake or you think we have been unfair, call us on it, and we will respond.
Hi, my name's Brooke, and I come from the future. So I'm here to tell you what can be done about this. So we're in a situation right now that feels like it's more or less unprecedented, and in terms of scale and volume of fake news, it is unprecedented. However, this has happened in the past, and there are things that can be done. And the answer to fake news and what we can do about it, which I prefer to call by its true name, which is propaganda and disinformation, true names, I should say. I feel as though calling it fake news devalues what it actually is, and this is, quite honestly, disinformation and propaganda. So this has happened every time a form of mass communication has been widely adopted. A new form, fake news, follows immediately afterward, followed a few years later by regulations and a new way of looking at mass communication. You guys may have heard of a game called Telephone, where you whisper something into the ear of the person next to you, and then that person whispers something, and so on. And then by the time you get to the end of it, it's a completely different message from the one that you first started out with. There's a basis in fact for this. That's how rumors get spread. People talk to one another, they call each other, they write things, they put things on the internet, they share stuff, they retweet stuff, or retoot, or whatever's going on now. There's some new social media sites that call it tooting. So that's very exciting. It's called Mastodon, by the way. So what can be done about it is, well, we already know what can be done about it. The only thing that can inoculate people against this sort of scourge of corrosive fake news is journalism. There's journalism and education, and I see journalism as an offshoot of education, because what we're doing as journalists is we're the sort of catalyst between policy and the public, right? It's up to us to sort of responsibly translate this dead kind of political language into lively language and explain to you how things in the world around you affect you. So we, as journalists, have to be able to do what we do. The only thing, really, over time, the only thing that consistently works, like I said, is journalism. And journalists have to be freed up to do what we want to do and what we can do and what we do best. We want to help. We want, well, most of us want to help. Some people are just, nobody here though, of course. But most of us really do want to help people. We really do want to tell stories. We want to understand the world so that we can help other people understand it as well. And we're a bunch of, you know, bleeding hearts for the most part. But what we need in order to do this is resources. We need to have, there's no better way to put it, we need money. And this isn't a call for you guys to open your wallets. This is actually a call to executives of any stripe or corporate donors or whatever. Put money into journalism. It is a public service that needs to have money put into it so that we can have the resources to do what we want. I have personally covered fires for 20 years. Fires without any fire protection, because there are no resources for it. This is probably illegal, but you know, if you're a contractor, nobody cares. If you're doing it, you know, as a freelancer, nobody cares. We need to have that kind of protection. We need to have somebody we can call when we get these death threats. We need to have, you know, fire masks so that when we inhale a spark live on the air, which has happened to me, by the way, we have some kind of recourse. We can't keep doing this on this razor-thin budget. And I believe that if there's more money put into journalism, then the entire country, and well, actually, the entire democratic institution, however it's interpreted by any country, will benefit. Because if you don't have basic facts that you can agree on, you don't have a democracy, however you interpret that democracy. If we do not have that, we have nothing. As I said, education does work to a certain degree, and I hear a lot about how people need to be educated, how the public needs to be educated, and I feel as though that places the onus unfairly on the individual who's reading the news. You know, people are busy, and they want information, and not everybody has the time or the wherewithal to go hunt down every single fact and to cross-reference it with primary sources and to understand, you know, what this means in the bigger picture of things. That's where we come in. That's why we exist. And if we're doing our job right and responsibly, that's what we're trying to serve up to people. So I kind of tend to get kind of annoyed when people say, oh, well, education's the only thing that fixes this. Because yes, education is important. Critical thinking is absolutely important. But we're this sort of link between that and democracy, the way I see it. We have to work on the culture. We have to understand that journalism is a public service. It's not a way to manipulate the masses. That's propaganda. It's not a way for us to feed our egos. Well, okay, it is a way for some of us to feed our egos. But at the same time, we're also trying to help. So what we need to do is accept this, that we need to change our culture, that we need to explain what journalism is to people. And what I see it as is a conversation, as I said, between policymakers and the public. Fund journalism. I promise you democracy will thrive as long as journalism is funded, free, and independent. Thank you.
Can you guys all hear us? I assume we have the yes?
No? How about now?
Let me start with a question and set it up by saying that yesterday, Friday,
Apologize for the audio issues. The audio system is tied to the internet, to the Wi-Fi system, so whenever the iPad loses Wi-Fi, their microphones get cut off.
Thank you. Much better. So as I was saying, I'm going to set this question up by saying that yesterday, I think it was about a dozen tech companies met to begin discussions collectively of what they can do leading into this next election cycle. But I want to ask you guys, we'll start with you, Brooke, we talked about what the public and what the media can do. What role do social media companies and tech companies play, and what can we expect from them?
I have a lot to say about this, and I have a very dim view of what social media and tech companies are doing at the moment. So until recently, I spent the last few years running a website called Snopes.com, which is a fact-checking site. So I was in a unique position. Thank you. I was in a unique position working with Facebook to see exactly what social media giants are doing and not doing. Unfortunately, what they're doing is not very much. There is a certain tendency to lean on algorithmic decisions and solutions to problems rather than human ones. And no matter how much I yelled and screamed and wailed and wept and rent my garments and everything, they wouldn't really listen to me. So this has led to some absolutely horrible situations across the world because a lot of people get their news from Facebook and Twitter. A lot of people only trust Facebook and Twitter to get their news. And when you're in a country that has been relatively isolated until recently, you're extremely vulnerable to fake news. So the case study that I always refer back to is Myanmar and the Rohingya Muslims and the enormous genocide and displacement that's affected them. And a lot of it has been driven by disinformation about what the Rohingya are doing. It's gotten to the point that Suu Kyi, who until fairly recently was a hero of mine, has said that she doesn't recognize them as citizens at all. And it turns out that this is because Facebook did not look for anybody who spoke Burmese. They couldn't find translators, so they couldn't crack down on fake news, so they were trying to rely on algorithms. This does not work. Algorithms don't work. You cannot have a tech solution to a people-driven problem. And so what my modest proposal is, which who knows if it's going to go anywhere, what I've been nagging people to do at tech companies is put money into a fund for journalism, a percentage of their profits every year to offset the damage that they've already done and will continue to do without putting human work into disinformation and its spread. That way, at least journalists can have a chance to do what we do best. And so it's going to take a while. That's another part of changing the culture. Tech companies have to understand that they are media. Social media companies are media, and they have been in denial about that. They are spreading information and disinformation, and they need to take responsibility. So I have much more to say, but I won't bore everybody.
I would just concur that the solution is a human solution. It is a human-created problem, and I think, we saw a very similar circumstance in India where there have been slayings because of disinformation that has spread about, people who stopped to help somebody at the side of the road being accused of crimes against kids. And I think unless there is the human intervention in these companies to realize we have got to take responsibility for the actions that spread the disinformation, it will continue to become a problem. That said, we have the First Amendment, and the same protections that we have as journalists are the same protections that individuals have to their freedom of speech and their freedom of expression. And so I think we have to be very, very careful about talking about restrictions that would impinge on the First Amendment in any way.
Sorry. It's not just India, by the way. There have been killings in Brazil. Kenya had to redo its election because of social media spread disinformation. Lithuania has suffered. I believe it was, no, Luxembourg, I'm sorry, the L's. Lithuania too, probably. Ukraine, even Russia, like the Russian public, although they've been cast as this sort of bugbear with fake news, the public suffers as well. Mexico, countries throughout Central and South America, Canada. I mean, it's a scourge, and it's being spread through social media. And WhatsApp, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and so on. You get the idea. And while I do strongly believe in free speech and First Amendment protections, I always like to say, freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence. If somebody's saying something offensive or hurtful or painful, then that, especially if it's disintegrating social norms, then that needs to be addressed. They can still say it. They just may have to, get smacked down for it, literally or figuratively. And so this is, again, it's not unprecedented, and it can be overcome fairly simply, but we're going to have go through a cultural, major sea change culturally in the way we talk about tech and social media.
Let me ask a question about fact-checking. In this last election cycle, I think it was unprecedented the amount of resources and staffing that went into real-time fact-checking, especially during the presidential debates. They both lied. I guess it's a matter of degree. But Do you think that that level of fact-checking will continue in the future? What lessons did we learn from that? Was it too much? Should we focus on broad issues rather than specific issues? How do we fact-check going forward? Let's start with Laura from a newspaper perspective, and then you from a global perspective.
I'm a fan. More information is better. So I don't think it's an either or. I think the fact-checking major news organizations, during the debates, both the New York Times and the Washington Post have real-time fact-checkers that people can, log on and use those as they're listening to the debates. I think that's important in addition to the broader stories. People want the broader stories. They want the wrap-up of the event, but I think having more fact-checking options that are reliable, credible, people know they can go. And again, it gets back to our responsibility as journalists to be neutral and fair. Fact-checking sites are not any good if you can't trust the accuracy and the credibility of the information. So I think it's an obligation for us to continue offering that kind of information, but ensuring that it stays unbiased.
I would also like to say that real-time fact-checking, it's just part of a solution. It's reactive rather than proactive, and so what needs to also be done is, as I keep calling it inoculation, a vaccination, whatever you want to call it, it sort of lays the groundwork for fact-checking in the future. If you have a contextualized, nuanced set of stories, if you can relate yourself to what's going on in these stories that you're reading or seeing or listening to, or that people are even telling you that they've read somewhere, if you understand your place in the world and this in relation to your place, if you can say, oh, okay, I live on this corner and there is, for some reason I keep talking about potholes. I don't know why, I'm just really into potholes lately. If there's a pothole in front of your house, not only do you want the city to understand that you have a pothole in front of your house, you want to be able to understand why the city hasn't come out and fixed that damn pothole yet. So what basis does this sit on? Where does this come from? Why is there a pothole? What does it mean? Is there a problem with the infrastructure? Is it just an oversight? And so on and so forth. People want to understand this. And if they don't have solid information to hang their worldview on, then they'll go for disinformation. It's just human nature. So if somebody tells you something plausible about why there's a pothole in front of your house, and it's just completely false, I almost said fake news, you're going to buy it because, who would lie about that, right? But if you already understand and you already know what's going on and you already have read about this sort of debate that's going on about funding in your city and the pothole problem, then you will you'll understand better what needs to be done about it and what you need to do. And so I think that there's many prongs to this, but most of it just boils down to, doing journalism.
Okay, it looks like we have about 10 minutes left, so 30-second answers with a buzzer from here on out. And let me ask a question of each of you, different question. Laura, here's a question. It appears that the UT is biased in its selection of articles and op-eds toward liberal and anti-Trump views. Is that the case?
I'll let you handle the op-eds.
Happy to.
I don't have anything to do with the opinion pages. In the news section, whoever has this question, I'm happy to talk with you at length afterwards. We strive very hard to be fair, both in the selection and in the tone of stories. We have the advantage of having a variety of news services to draw from. So I spend a lot of my day reading various versions of news stories that we're going to consider putting into the newspaper. I and my colleagues try very hard to be as neutral, unbiased, fair as we possibly can. So, do we make mistakes? Yes, we do. It is not out of a bias. And if you have specific examples that you would like to talk to me about, I am happy to do that. And you can call me, email me if you see things that you're concerned about. But I assure you there is a lot of time and discussion spent trying to make the fairest, most equitable choices, both in which stories we put in the paper and the tone and approach of those stories.
And in terms of the editorial page, this is not a 20-second answer, but that's what you're going to get, unfortunately. I choose syndicated columnists spanning the spectrum, from the right, Michael Gerson, George Will, David Brooks. Not all those folks are Trump supporters. We used to run Charles Krauthammer a lot more. Unfortunately, he has passed. Very recently, we run syndicated columnists on the left. We try for a range of views. If you think I fall short, email me. And I would appreciate the chance to talk to you about that. Brooke, a question for you on the pay of journalism, right? So we gave information away for free when websites started. How do we get people to think that they want to pay for news?
Well, again, it's a public service and I believe that information should be free and blah, blah, blah. However, I mean, were you asking what newspapers can do, or are you asking why people should
No,
pay?
more about the dynamics. Like, I think it's interesting that, it used to be that newspapers and media was an advertising-funded model. Now it's becoming almost a reader-driven model.
I mean, I don't see any problem with advertising as long as the advertisements are fully, they're clearly ads, So here's the thing about media. The money is there. There is a ton of money in media. However, journalism is what's the term, a loss leader? Like, you can't put financial value on it immediately because it loses money like crazy. Again, it has to be this sort of seen as this cultural public service. And people can't be compelled to pay for it, but at the same time, I think that corporations should be. I think that subscription models work to a certain extent, but again, that's putting the onus on the people. I think that underwriters and donors should be kind of on the hook for this because, again, it is a public service that offsets the amount of disinformation, advertising, propaganda, outright fake news that gets kind of put out into the information ecosystem. However, I do think that advertising works and subscription models work. I think that a variety of things would work, but ultimately there have to be ways to get information to people for free.
Laura, a question for you. What about news that is not censored but not reported? How do you make decisions about stories to cover? I get emails all the time from people saying, you didn't cover story X. Why? What goes into your thought process?
Well, that's probably one of the most difficult issues we have. The physical newspaper has a limited amount of space. The great thing about the web is it's unlimited. But our resources are not unlimited. And to Brooke's point, journalism is expensive. Not unprofitable necessarily, but it is expensive. And the reporters and the people that we have creating journalism, they deserve to be paid and paid a living wage. So our choices have to be informed by what we think is best serving our community. And obviously we're a local paper. San Diego stories about the county, stories about issues that affect San Diegans are the priority, recognizing that there are lots of national and international stories that are important and have resonance here. The kinds of things that may seem as though we're leaving out may be of less consequence to a greater number of people. We have to look at all of those things that make up news, immediacy, consequence, those kinds of things when we're making our choices about what to cover and what to include in the paper. But again, we try to represent a diversity of ideas, opinions, interests within the pages of the newspaper.
Brooke, a question for you about headline sensationalism. I got into this a little bit. There's a great 7-minute or so video. If you guys Google Al Jazeera headline video, you'll probably see it. It talks about the history of headline writing, and it points out that when Hitler died, the headline said, Hitler died. When Osama bin Laden was killed, the headline said, we got the bastard. So I guess my question for you is, in terms of headline sensationalism, does that help or hurt journalism?
If it's done right, it can be helpful. However, I think that headlines can be effective and enraging for the same reason that disinformation can be, because it uses emotions to pull you in. And I understand, we need those clicks, you know, we need people to read, we need people to listen to what we're saying and to pay attention to what we're saying. But I do think that with a sensationalistic headline, it tends to degrade the quality of the story, no matter how good the story is. If you have some, "we got the bastard" headline, everything that you read after that is going to be tainted by that. So you have to be mindful. I think that there's definitely a balance that can be struck between entertaining and interesting, but I think that it's way too easy to go to these emotion words, which I would like to point out is what makes a lot of fake news so effective, because you're getting pulled in, that amygdala is getting stimulated. You know, it's like, oh my God, I'm so scared, or I'm so angry, or I have such schadenfreude, I can't believe it, you know, they got him. And I think that that's lazy, frankly. I think that there's ways that can be done that aren't so lazy. And it's not fair for me to say lazy because we're all so overworked, but at the same time, that's what it is.
Laura, we showed the slide about the AP threat. Have staff at the UT, do they receive death threats? Have they received death threats or threats of violence or harm?
People have received threats of harm, some overt, some less than overt, but I think probably less than some of the national news organizations. But, you know, it's a concern, and certainly in this divisive era, we're conscious of our own safety and protecting those around us.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. So I'll ask them of both of you. The last one is a really short one, but let me ask this one. When all this talk of fake news, mainstream media, is there a distinction to be drawn between local journalists and national journalists, and how do you draw that so that it's not all one big pool of fake news? Yeah, I guess the question is, when politicians, from local councilmen to folks in the White House, use the term fake news, they tend to use it broadly. Is there a distinction how do you kind of combat that as a specific journalist in a specific outlet to say, well, wait a second?
Well, I think, and you know, because we've had this conversation, I'm not a fan of the term fake news. The idea of disinformation, I think, has been used very broadly. And I think the attack that we're seeing on journalism is really, in many cases, an attack on truth-telling. To me, I think the broad brush attack is not mindful of national versus local. I do think it's on journalists and the idea of being allied with the truth. And our allegiance on the news side first is to the truth. And I think that's where, and I don't think that people who are using it as kind of a weapon are drawing a distinction at all between local and national.
So I started in local news and went from local to national and international, and I can tell you that every single time without fail, this has been a constant throughout my career, the second you say something that a politician doesn't like, they'll attack your credibility mercilessly. They'll be like, oh, well, that's just fake news, you know, she's got a bias. It's like, no, actually, you straight up lied to me about this. So yeah, actually, I do have a bias against you now. But that has been an ongoing thing. And there's this misquote, I can't remember who it was attributed to originally, and whoever you hear it attached to is probably not true, but I still like the quote. It's, you know, journalism is what people don't want to hear, everything else is public relations. It's been misattributed to Orwell, but I'm pretty sure he didn't actually say it. But that's exactly what you have to do. You have to say things that people don't like, especially politicians, and then you have to endure them telling you that you're too young to understand, or you don't know what you're talking about, or maybe you should go back to journalism school, or maybe you need another job, and so on. It never, ever ends.
One last real quick question, because we are out of time here. Give the group one piece of advice that we haven't touched on yet that they can use to kind of combat fake news.
Be skeptical. Be as skeptical as a journalist is skeptical.
And I already brought this up, but my favorite rule of thumb is if you're reading something and you're feeling a very strong emotion, if you're pissed off or you're frustrated or you're upset or you're fearful or you're feeling schadenfreude and you're like, oh, I can't believe how stupid that person is, check your sources, because you're probably being manipulated and or played. Check your sources. I'm not saying it's wrong. Just make sure you know what you're reading and cross-check it. It takes a quick Google. I'm not asking people to like do primary sources or anything. Just watch your gut. If you're feeling strong emotion, check your sources.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.